Great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the NLI USA Signature Speaker Series. I'm Adina Canefield, the CEO of NLI USA. I am delighted to bring to you our talk today, which is really focused on the heart and the lifeblood of the National Library of Israel, our collections, and in particular, our Judaica collection, which is one of the most significant in the world. I just returned from Israel, where I not only saw many of our treasures, but I deeply felt the power of the library, and I sensed firsthand its role in preserving the treasures of our people. Our speakers today are at the helm of the library's sacred work in saving our treasures and in making them accessible to our community. Today's talk is one of the many ways that the library shares its treasures and uses them to enrich the community's life. I had the opportunity to meet Raquel and Yoel just last week and in person, and I now feel even more privileged to introduce them to you today. Dr. Raquel Euclides is the head of collections at the National Library of Israel. She is responsible for the overall development of all NLI collections and for digital, cultural, and educational initiatives based on those collections, carried out by the library on its own or in partnership with other institutions. A New York native, Raquel received her BA from Princeton and MA from Harvard in comparative Jewish and Islamic studies. She has published and taught on a wide array of subjects related to comparative Jewish and Islamic traditions, and more recently on historical currents that shape Israeli society. Dr. Yoel Finkelman is curator of the Chaim and Hannah Solomon Judaica collection at the National Library of Israel. He's been with the library since 2014, focusing on collection development and digitization. Formerly a lecturer at Bar Ilan University and a teacher of Torah in Jerusalem, his book, Strictly Kosher Reading, Popular Literature and the Condition of Contemporary Orthodoxy, appeared in 2011. Before I turn to them, I want to remind you to pose questions to our amazing speakers. Put them in the chat function, and our speakers will be addressing them towards the end of their talk today. With that, I bring you Raquel and Yoel. Enjoy the treasure hunt with them. Raquel, Yoel.
Thank you so much, Adina. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone from across the globe. It's so exciting to be here together. And it's a real privilege for me to launch a series with our collection curators. I'll just say a few sentences about our collections. At the National Library of Israel, we have 4 core collections. We have 2 national collections. We are unique in the world of national libraries in that we are both the national collection of our local geographic place, that is the state of Israel, and we are the National Library of the Jewish people. And so we are going to start our series with Yoel, our Judaica curator. And Yoel is going to take us behind the scenes for some real-time decision-making about how you go about building the world's greatest Judaica collection. But before he does that, I want to start us off to enter into what is special about our institution. The project of building the world's greatest Judaica collection can be traced back even before the founding of our library. And it was a dream that crystallized in the second half of the 19th century through a series of projects, dreams, and initiatives by Jewish intellectuals both in Europe and in Palestine. And the dream was this: Jewish culture was spread over the globe. Jewish culture and Jewish literature was found in libraries throughout the world. Now, how do you gather the fruits of Jewish literature as the idea started to develop about gathering the Jewish people? And so the initiatives began, really small, modest, yet very ambitious initiatives to gather and preserve the spiritual inheritance, of the Jewish people in one place, so that they won't be scattered throughout the libraries of the world. Now, one of the many intellectuals who were involved in these projects is a man named Dr. Joseph Chazanovich, who was born in 1844 and died in 1918, and lived much of his life in Bialystok, but traveled throughout Europe and in our region. Now, what was interesting about Chazanovich was that he was both a dreamer and a doer. That is, like others, he had great visions of gathering the fruits, the greatest fruits of Jewish literature. But he also did. How did he do? He was a doctor, and instead of taking payment, he collected books. And he gathered them with the vision of congregating all of these books in a central national library in Jerusalem. He also raised money and he networked. And over the course of his lifetime, he gathered 22,000 books that he sent over sets of 5,000 at a time. And he also raised money to rent a building to house this national library. And in 1892, a library that was then called Midrash Abravanel opened, using his collection and a collection that was gathered by the great linguist Eliezer Ben Yehuda. Now, Chazanovich passed away in 1918. We're looking at, well, I'm going to show you two articles from the Sentinel, a Jewish newspaper from Chicago. One is commemorating Chazanovich's legacy. Here it talks about 10,000 books, which were the original shipment, but eventually there were more. And then 2 years later, another mover and shaker, a dreamer and a doer, took the helm. And that is the noted philosopher, Zionist activist, and someone who actually had library experience, which was different from a lot of these figures. And his name was Hugo Bergman. Hugo Bergman was the chief librarian of the library, which by then was called the Jewish National and University Library, part of the emerging Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And Bergman set as a goal to expand the collections. And so here we see, also from the Sentinel, this wonderful title of Scholars of All Races Aid in the Developing the Jewish Library. And so this project of building the greatest library, the greatest Jewish library in the world, has been continuing for all of 130 years of the National Library's existence and even before. Now, if we were to fast forward 90 years from this date, here we are in the end of 2021, on the threshold of a new chapter of our own history. And hopefully by next year, we will be in a gorgeous new facility that will be able to serve as the open and inviting space for people both in Israel and all over the world to see the Jewish treasures and the other collections that we have, in order to both enjoy and study, to meet and to work together in this ongoing task. We joke that it started 130 years ago, and perhaps it'll end in 500 years, but perhaps it'll keep going. Recently, we counted how many institutional partnerships we've developed just in the United States, and after 119, we stopped counting. And this is the way the National Library sees its role and continues its work. Now, without further ado, I want to pass the microphone over to my colleague, Yoel, who is going to share with you behind the scenes, how do we actually do the daily work of building this amazing collection. Yoel.
Yoel, you're on mute. Yoel, you're on mute. You need to unmute, Yoel. Daron, can you please help him unmute?
Thanks, Daron. Thanks, Raquel. Yeah, actually, before we get into the discussion of collections development and dilemmas, I want to follow up a little bit about what Raquel mentioned regarding the vision. And one of the things that I've had the opportunity to do in the last couple of months while writing something for an exhibit catalog we're working on is to go back into the historical archives of the library itself and to try to trace when this vision came about and how the vision came about. And three things about the vision of the earliest founders of what is today the National Library of Israel became clear to me. The first is that they saw the National Library, they envisioned a complete collection, really from very early on. Their ideas, even before they had a building, before Chazanovich and Bergman had the kind of resources we have today, they were already speaking in clear terms of trying to create not a library for the city of Jerusalem, but a massive collection of as complete as possible of everything related to Jews, Judaism, the Zionist movement, and the contexts of those. And they also, a second principle that they had was cooperation. Some of this was just practical. The Zionist movement and the library in the early years had very little money. And so it was necessary to create friends organizations around the Jewish world, people who participated in the vision or shared the vision of the library and would be willing to send books, send periodicals. It was very important. They couldn't always get, with the mail such that it was, they couldn't always get periodicals delivered to Jerusalem. And so there would be delivery spots of groups of leaders around the world who would subscribe to Jewish and general periodicals and then pack them up and ship them off to Jerusalem. And the third thing that they envisioned was that the library wasn't just going to be a research facility, it was going to be a symbol. In other words, this cooperation was not just about how do we get books, but it was about how we make the relationship between the institution, the library, and the books and the documents that are there with the people, the Jewish people around the world, the Zionist movement, the residents of the land of Israel, so that they could feel that they're participating in this in some kind of full way. And I think about research libraries as we talked about this when we were planning the talk, of as kinds of enzymes. You know, it's one institution, it's one building in one city, but when you think about it, it's kind of this catalyst of all kinds of changes and developments that happen all over the place. And an idea that somebody might read in a novel, or a sermon one might hear in the synagogue, or a newspaper article that one might read about current events. In the end of the day, that depends upon having access to real, accurate, reliable information. For writers and scholars and public intellectuals and general public to be able to say, I'm interested in this. How do I get it? How do I get that it's true? What do I discover? What heritage do I want us to be able to keep our hands on? And then that becomes part of the raw material that transforms things that are happening in classrooms, in synagogues, in Hebrew schools, in films, in novels, and in culture all over the place. And so we're not just collecting this stuff so that it'll sit on a shelf. We're collecting it that it will be used and read, and also that the very fact that we collect it says something about the value of collective memory for the Jewish people. And this two-directional relationship between the library and its readers and the Jewish people is really central to what we do. Now, on a daily basis, kind of the more boring, if you will, mundane aspects of our work in developing the collection involves a team of people who Raquel and I work with on a daily basis, whose expertise is languages. And who have knowledge of content. And basically their responsibilities are to collect in every imaginable language according to the policy. And so we can work on just from this week, going over lists of books in Spanish that range from translations of scholarly and rabbinic texts into Spanish to poetry by key Jewish figures who wrote in Spanish, or simply collecting. Somebody put together 17 volumes, kind of self-published 17 volumes of documents in Chinese and Russian about Jewish life on the border between China and Siberia. So, how do we get as much as possible about the material that's coming out today, from Korean to English to Arabic to French and German, etc.? That's kind of our ongoing day-to-day work. And there's no way that I can really succeed in describing everything about our collection, but I want to begin, or at least in this section of our discussion, talk about 3 case studies of how we go about developing the collection. One case study will be HighEnd Treasures. The real, you can count on a few hands the amount of super important manuscripts, the most important documents in the history of the Jewish people, and also partnership. Often these documents are extraordinarily expensive, not the kinds of things that public institutions purchase. And so we develop the cooperation and develop the collection through donations of major philanthropists. And here's an example. We're looking at one of the most important Haggadot, Passover Haggadot in the world. It was created roughly in 1450 by arguably the most famous and important scribe and artist of the Jewish Middle Ages and Renaissance, a fellow named Yoel ben Shimon, who about depending on how you want to count, probably about 15 or 20 of his manuscripts survive until today. And you can see just from these images, he was a master calligrapher and he was a master artist. And he created this Passover Haggadah with, can you see my cursor? These lovely images of slaves, well, sort of working in Egypt, except that the slaves are dressed as high-end, wealthy Italian Renaissance figures, and the Egyptian towns of the biblical period look just like castles you might find in the hills of Tuscany. And you can see the scene. There's been some damage to this Passover scene, but you can see the cooking of the barbecuing of the Paschal sacrifice, and a family sitting around the table preparing for their Passover Seder. Now this is it's called the Rothschild Haggadah, and this is referred to as the Rothschild Haggadah, largely because it was owned by the Rothschild family, and its story of how it came to us, or how it came to be in the hands of the Rothschilds and then in our collection, tells us something about the challenges of modern Jewish history, but also something about the place of the library in popular, in national consensus. The item was held by the Rothschild family in Paris when the Nazis came in to Paris. It was looted and it disappeared. And at some point, it was purchased by a fellow named Dr. Fred Murphy, who didn't quite know what it was, but donated it to Yale University, his alma mater. And it was a prized treasure of Yale University until roughly 1980, when somebody discovered what it was and where it had come from. We'll get back in some of our later dilemmas conversation about some of these questions about Nazi looted property and the difficulties of tracing items through 20th century Jewish history. But the Rothschild family, when it was discovered that this treasure that had been held in their private family collection prior to the war had been rediscovered after the war, they made a decision, upon receiving it back from Yale University, to donate it to the National Library. And we see here this dynamic that Raquel and I have been talking about in terms of this two-way relationship between the library and the Jewish people. The Rothschild family felt that it would be fitting and symbolic that something like this, one of the great treasures of Jewish cultural heritage, would sit in Jerusalem and would sit in an institution who is dedicated to preserving the collective memory and the culture of the Jewish people and the people of Israel. And so here, a more close-up picture, you can see the wonderful decorated letters that Yoel has created, and the cherev, the sword, the divine sword, which kind of bursts through the heavens. Jews tend not to give God a face. Even this hand and the sword is a little bit edgy, but he's depicting this scene of divine might, which is of course an important theme of the Passover Seder. So part of the collection, one of our methods of collecting, involves donations from certain select kinds of people who have the wherewithal to acquire materials like this and who see our library not only as a place to preserve the items physically, but to symbolically treat them as part of not just personal owned property, but national, cultural, historical heritage. Now, another method of collecting is the much more routine things and the kind of items that you might not read about in the newspaper, you might not see decorated on your Passover table in a facsimile or in a picture, but a kind of, frankly, on the surface, dull document, black and white, a pamphlet on relatively cheap paper, from 1936. And this is a document that I came across by accident. I wasn't looking for it. I don't even remember why I found it. But once I found it and I was flipping through it, I immediately got onto the phone with a number of friends and colleagues, academics and researchers, because I was super excited by it. And this is a different kind of model. I'm not actually 100% sure when and how this item was purchased, but I can guess, or donated, but I can guess that this was not the kind of thing that you're going to see in a Sotheby's auction catalog and have to work with putting together a team of major donors to acquire. It's a kind of run-of-the-mill thing that somebody might have donated after finding it cleaning out a recently deceased relative's apartment, or might have appeared in a used bookstore. And you can see from the signatures on the top that it was previously owned and used by somebody else. We didn't buy it straight from the bookstore. And it looks pretty unassuming. And because we have the kinds of connections that we have with leading researchers, we're able to see that this is actually a treasure. And what it amounts to is a kind of, at the top, spelled in Yiddish, Sarah Schnerer, Demamis Tzava. And this was put out about a year after the death of Sarah Schnerer. Sarah Schnerer, who to this day is a kind of folk hero among Orthodox Jews, among people dedicated to Jewish feminism, among people dedicated to Jewish education. She, in the interwar years, almost, in some ways, almost single-handedly founded Poland's largest Jewish school network for girls. And she realized in the interwar years, as there were massive cultural changes going on in East European Jewry, massive secularization, just tremendous cultural changes and generational changes in which pious grandparents were watching their modern children from the perspective of the grandparents abandoning the tradition, from the perspective of the grandchildren freeing themselves to the modern world. And Sarah Schneer said there has to be a school system for girls to teach them the basics of tradition. And she built it, and it became this massive school system throughout interwar Poland. And she deservedly has become a folk hero. And upon her death, the Beis Yaakov movement, the system of schools that she developed, began publishing some of her writings, including this one, De Mamas Tzava, a mother's will. And it's not about her property. She was not a wealthy woman. It is her ethical will for, she had no children of her own, an ethical will for her students. Um, um, and okay, that's the kind of thing people publish. First of all, it caught my eye because I'm personally very interested in Beis Yaakov. There's an enormous amount about the founding of the school system that we don't know. I'm also interested because not long before I saw this document, we purchased on auction a case of student notebooks from the Beis Yaakov Seminary in Krakow. Actually, the students sitting there learning to become a teacher, and her notes on her various classes. And this reminded me of that. But the thing that really caught my eye in all of this was this. You can see if you read Hebrew at the top or Yiddish at the top, prenumerantin. And as soon as I saw that word, I immediately picked up the phone to my friend, Elly Fisher, a translator and scholar working on a PhD in Tel Aviv University. He's studying the phenomenon of prenumerantin. Prenumerantin are subscriber lists. How do you fund a book publishing project between the 17th and early 20th century? You go around and find lists of people who are willing to promise to buy a copy in advance, to send their money in advance to buy a pre-publishing copy. And then as the books were published, they would be the lists of the pre-subscribers would be printed in the back as a kind of thank you. And Elly is doing some absolutely marvelous work on prenumerantin, among other things, saying, well, if we figure out who supported the publication of a book and we put it on a map, then we'll know something about the cultural influence of the author, the geographical cultural influence of the author. That's a marvelous thing. He's using, high-end technical computerized tools to kind of map the cultural influence of authors on the basis of prenumerantin. Now, the wonderful thing about this list of prenumerantin is, number one, that most of the subscribers are women. He said, I'd never seen anything like that. Secondly, and and I'm going to give an example. Whoops. Please don't freeze, computer. Do you still see the slides? There we go. I kind of chose to highlight one town, right? They're listed by towns geographically. The town here is Drahabich, and I chose to highlight that town because my mother-in-law grew up there, and so it caught my eye. But what also caught my eye, in addition to the list of names that are listed here, Miriam Rokeach, Gittel Rappaport, Chana Rappaport, Belka Ardman, etc., Chelka Morgenstern, is Bibliothek Schendeldorf. The pretty town library, and you can kind of realize that probably the Beis Yaakov school in that town set up a little library, a lending library for its students. And when there was an opportunity to pre-subscribe to this. So here we have not only a document that you would not notice. It's not illuminated, it's not a manuscript, it's not fancy, frankly, not all that expensive. And scholars are going to be interested in it. This list of prenumerantin, Elly also told me, doesn't appear in any of the indexes of prenumerantin lists. Undoubtedly because the men who put together those indexes didn't bother to look for it. Because they weren't going to find, they're used to looking in heavy rabbinic texts. They're not used to looking in these kinds of women's stuff. I say with my tongue in cheek, right? So we have this document, simple document that ends up being a very interesting data point about women's culture in East Europe, among East European Jewries, the economics of publication, the cultural influence of the Beis Yaakov movement, and also something about the role of early libraries or libraries in local towns. Drohobych was a pretty big city in today in Ukraine, Jewishly culturally part of Poland. So we've talked about highlights and how sometimes that involves donations from major philanthropists. We've talked about routine collection of all kinds of obscure and relatively seemingly insignificant documents. And another method that we have for developing the collection is digital today. And here, I brought this document not only for diversity, but also because I wanted to surprise you, right? This doesn't look like a Jewish document. This is the Al-Kalim newspaper. Al-Kalim, which means the spokesman, and thank you to Professor Chagai Ben Shammai, the former head of our department, and Raquel, who helped me out with the Arabic. I don't read Arabic, and this is from the Karaite community, the large and very influential Karaite community in Egypt, and by 1945, by the 1940s, they've gradually, the Karaite community, which has its roots in the early Middle Ages and a major ideological and cultural split between the Karaites who, to grossly oversimplify things, kind of believed in the Bible itself, and the rabbinates who believed in the rabbinic tradition and the Talmud. So the Karaite community, which was kind of from the rabbinic perspective, were kind of semi-outsiders, and as far as we're concerned, are just plain old part of the Jewish Judaica collection. So by the 1940s, the Karaite community had switched over largely from Judeo-Arabic, from Arabic written in Hebrew characters, to regular Arabic, Arabic in Arabic characters. And in this cover page of Al-Kalim, we have a celebration of King Farouk's birthday. Probably they were, both genuinely patriotic, and probably also realized that celebrating the king's birthday is a wise move politically. So in addition to kind of helping to identify the scope, I suspect that many listeners and many readers in our library wouldn't necessarily assume that such a document like this would exist. A Jewish newspaper in Arabic characters from Cairo in just at the end of World War II. What I want to point to in terms of our collections development is the stamp that you see here. This is not a newspaper that we have the original of. The original is held, to translate what I just read, the Jewish Karaites of Israel, the Central Library. And we created a relationship with, and we have an ongoing relationship with the Karaite community, which largely centers in the city of Ramla in Israel, to digitize material from their collection, periodicals, books, manuscripts, to help make those materials available. And I'm just going to click on the hyperlink here. Tell me if you see this. Do you see, you still seeing the newspaper, or are you now seeing my, you're now seeing the Historical Jewish Press site?
It looks like the document is loading, Yoel, so why don't you keep going a few more sentences?
Okay, well, I'm just going to redo the share to take a look here. Here we see the Historical Jewish Press, and this is something, not only do we do digital collecting, not only do we scan items and put it up on the internet for readers around the world, we've also developed search tools and the like. Here, this is the Historical Jewish Press site, colloquially called JPress, which basically creates, gives readers access to thousands and thousands of pages, millions of pages actually, of historical Jewish newspapers with full text search. We don't have a lot of time, so we're not going to go, but just, we can just quickly run through the first page of the list of Jewish newspapers that anybody can read and search from around the world, and you can see the region, the country, the language, the years that it covers, French, English, Polish, Portuguese, German, Hungarian, Romanian, Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, and we could keep going if we would just scroll through this list and see so many examples of the ways in which digitization allows us not only to collect more, but to make that more available. And Raquel and I's colleague, Dr. Chezi Amiur, who's responsible for the Israel collection, has pointed out that Israeli or from the land of Israel newspapers from the land of Israel that have been scanned on JPress suddenly start appearing in scholarly articles because they're accessible. And so this idea of cooperation and digitization as key to developing a collection that will be deep and wide and include both the obvious and the obscure, both the beautiful and the mundane, digitization is a third model. Helps us do that. And I should mention in passing, we have a whole bunch of other digital projects. Probably the leading and most important one is a site called Ktiv, which gathers together close to 100,000 Hebrew manuscripts from around the world, dating from the 5th and 6th centuries until the 20th century. About 100,000 Hebrew character manuscripts from around the world, and again, which can be viewed from the comfort of your own home. And so, and that's kind of, due to time considerations, a kind of way of thinking about collections development. There's these big, gigantic feature, world-class items. There's the routine collection of seemingly mundane things that actually creates the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, because there's all kinds of hidden treasures in there. And then there's digital collection, which we're able to do today as a way of expanding even beyond what we can physically hold in the building. Raquel, take it away.
So we wanted to share with you not only the behind the scenes decision-making processes of how we have worked in the past, but also to bring in real-time dilemmas that we have as we move forward in our collecting. And so Yoel and I are going to share just 2 out of many kinds of dilemmas that we think about on a regular basis when it comes to building the Judaica collection. Yoel, if you would turn to the next slide.
Yeah. So dilemmas. We're dealing with dilemmas constantly. And, every time I knock on Raquel's office and say, what do you think about this? Right. And then we throw these dilemmas back and forth to each other. And some of those are, usually they're also kind of pretty mundane. Right? Is it worth to go check out this scholar's library to find out if there are things there that we don't have and he's willing to donate? Something is available for sale. Do we have enough budget, and is it worth the money? How do we prioritize when we don't have enough budget? But here, there's kinds of typical dilemmas that occupy us on a day-to-day basis. But here I want to get into a little bit of a deeper and more international challenge, if you will. We talked a little bit about the Rothschild Haggadah and the challenges of modern Jewish history. I like to put it this way to explain part of the dilemma. If we go back 150, if we go back to the, Raquel mentioned 130 years. If we go back to the founding of the Midrash Abarbanel, the earliest years of the National Library, and as the library was being founded, we made a list of the 10 or 15 most important Jewish cities in the world. I don't know what important means, but Vilna would be there, and Cairo would be there, and Baghdad would be there, and you can continue to make your list of these important, influential, cultural and intellectual and economic cities for the Jewish people. If we made that list for 130 years ago and we made similar lists today, not a single city would be on both lists.
Amazing.
And that's a testimony, a kind of heuristic to think about the vast cultural and demographic and geographic changes of the Jewish people. Sometimes that was by choice or semi-choice. Millions of Jews who left Eastern Europe between 1880, let's say, and 1925. Due to economic conditions, due to persecution, and scattered themselves around the world, building Jewish communities around the world. Some of those were expulsions of various kinds, like the community of Baghdad, where following the founding of the state, Jews often found themselves not welcome. Some of those are results of the massive successes. Tel Aviv barely existed as a city when the National Library was founded, and today it's certainly in the top few cities, important cities for the Jewish people. Some of it is a result of course, tragic persecution and mass murder of the Holocaust. So this raises all kinds of, first of all, it creates a sense of urgency to document older communities. It creates a lack of documentation because immigration, even happy immigration, wreaks havoc on cultural collections. But it also creates ethical dilemmas and legal dilemmas. Because, like the Rothschild Haggadah, it was private property prior to the war, was looted by the Nazis, clearly illegal, clearly immoral, purchased by an innocent person who was just trying to do good, donated to the Yale University Library, which helped to preserve it. The only people who did anything wrong here were the Nazis themselves. And here we have an odd situation today in which all kinds of cultural heritage of the Jewish people, textual documentation of the Jewish people, we can trace where it was or where it probably had been back then, and might be able to find it today, and we don't know what happened in between. And what do you do with this stuff? How do you make sure that it goes back to its rightful owner? And I put rightful owner in quotes because how are you going to figure out who's right when it's clear? It's easier to figure out who the bad guys are, harder to figure out who the good guys are. And so there has been in the last year, I think, a terrible backlash against some of the private collectors of this material. All kinds of collectors who in the 70s and 80s made it their business to acquire Jewish-related books, Jewish-related documents that had some point been part of the communal heritage of Jewish people, whether in the Islamic world or in Europe. And they held it and they preserved it in their own homes and at their own expense. And yet there's a way in which these are cultural documents that don't belong to any individual. They belong to the Jewish people. They belong to the communities that once lived in these places, that still live in these places, the descendants of those communities who still see themselves as attached to those places in Europe or in the Islamic world. Who has rights to these? And there's all kinds of legal aspects to this, which I'm certainly not qualified to talk about. But there's been a great deal of discussion in the press and in legal circles about what to do. And even several instances where items that fit these descriptions were put up on auction and then removed from auction because there was a backlash and a sense that, first of all, these shouldn't just be sold as if they're commodities, and a sense that the collectors who are selling them now have done something wrong, not necessarily, at least to my mind. And this created a problem, not only a problem because it's hard to figure out what the right end point should be, but also because practically speaking, if you can't sell these items on auction and in public, then they're going to be sold on the black market privately. And then the public institutions and communities and the Jewish people as a whole will have trouble getting them. And one of the things that we did when there were 7 Hungarian, mostly what are called pinkasim, they're communal record books. Here we have one. I wrote down the relatively simple pronunciation. There's several different pronunciations of every town in Hungary. Uhil of this is the Chevra Kadisha. You can see the words Chevra Kadisha here in Latin characters. This is the Chevra Kadisha book. Here we have the record book, The Finances of a Town of Bussermann, which is the Germanized name for the town. There's actually a Hungarian name for the town, which I didn't put here and I wouldn't even try to pronounce. And here we have a list of the financial records, 1910 to 1943. Also, by the way, the previous document that we had seen on the previous slide was the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society that was active during World War II. Not before World War II, not after World War II, a document that includes the years 1942, 1943, when there was still some kind of functioning burial society in these towns. And here, in addition to concerns kind of standard, how much are these worth? What we ended up doing was to say, let's create a win-win-win situation for everybody involved. Let's approach the private owner who wants to sell his documents and is getting a lot of pressure as if he's done something wrong. And again, I don't know if he has or has not. The Hungarian Jewish community, which says this is our cultural heritage, the National Library of Israel, which sees itself and has been seen for 100 and some odd years as a library of the Jewish people, and has financial resources and institutional resources like preservation and digitization. Let's create a team in which when we turn to the Hungarian Jewish Museum and Archive, my friend and colleague, Dr. Zsuzsa Toronyi, and we said, okay, let's you and I, the National Library of Israel, the Hungarian Jewish Museum and Archive, let's jointly purchase these documents from the private owner. Let's digitize them. Let's put them up on the internet. We'll preserve them. And here we have a situation in which everybody wins. The private donor who may or may not have done anything wrong, doesn't become a criminal, doesn't face the kind of social pressure and public pressure he was facing. He gets to sell something that he paid for in good faith for a reasonable price. The people of Israel own it. And the Hungarian Jewish community symbolically owns it, given that there isn't really a functioning and long-lasting Jewish community within these towns with the tools to preserve these kinds of documents. And this is a model that we'd like to expand. I've already reached out to a number of bodies in Europe and in the United States and in Israel to try to create similar kinds of relationships because win-wins are better than the alternatives. And one of the things that we can do as this large institution with a major reputation is to kind of go in there and be an enzyme, if I can use my metaphor again, a catalyst for positive change and to help lead the field as a whole and not just be kind of closed off in our own reading rooms and our own book storage areas. So that's kind of behind the scenes. How do we go about doing things in the kind of unstandard ways that takes us another step forward in our attempt to preserve and make available Jewish heritage in a way that really does maintain, in this case, a three-directional relationship with different parties and not just a two-dimensional. Raquel,
Thanks.
I know that you've spent enormous amounts of time and energy dealing not so much with the pre-World War I, World War II era, but with the technological era of the 21st century. So I'll pass the microphone on to you to talk about digital-born material and digital collecting.
Thanks, Yoel. So I noticed someone asked in the chat, will the future generations preserve Jewish culture as enthusiastically as we are talking? And that leads us to our second and final dilemma. Yoel, if you could change turn the slide. And it leads us to one of the major questions that we struggle with today, and that is, given that Jewish culture, society, community is primarily on the web today and in social media, what's our role? What's the role of the Library of the Jewish People in capturing and documenting contemporary Jewish culture? How do you archive the Jewish internet? We're looking at an example from the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. which is very fun if you want to try it out, but it's very limited because you have to know the URL of what you're looking for. It turns out that they capture the Chabad website 13,000 times. It turns out the Chabad, as they are often early adopters, they were one of the first Jewish websites. And so the first capture is here we are at the end of 1996. And of course, if we were to scroll into what the Chabad website looks like today, it would look very different. And so the National Library has been doing archiving of the internet since the 90s in pilot programs and more in a more expansive way over the last several years. And this year we took a year to rethink and to reach out to partners both in Israel and in Europe and America to learn best practices and to start to build that collaborative model that Yoel has talked about in several different ways, which is how we like to work, in order to work together to take on this massive task. And so starting next year, we're going to be expanding our work in internet archiving, both to capture in real time prominent Jewish websites that are changing all the time on a regular basis, and also to curate subjects and topics that we think that scholars today and those future generations that someone talk about would be interested in mining to continue this work of how do you build the world's greatest Judaica collection into the digital age. And if Yoel, if you could turn the slide to just show one example of this work of digital collecting, and that is, here we are, hopefully towards the end, but we don't know, of this very intensive period of COVID-19. My colleagues have done a wonderful project of capturing digital posters in Jewish communities in Europe and beyond, and in order to preserve material, a kind of time capsule for scholars who are going to look back on this period and to ask, how did Jewish communities deal? How did they celebrate the Pesach Seder? How did the schools function during this time? And so through our internet archiving work and our digital collecting work, whether it's posters or music or reports or newspapers, so that the work of collecting and preserving and making accessible of the Jewish culture, history, religion, and community continues into the 21st century. And with that, we're going to bring our formal presentation to a close. I see there are many, many questions. I turn it back over to our host, Adina, in order to help us field some of these questions. And of course, Yoel and I and our colleagues are open and inviting to you to send us questions and queries. And if you have ideas for projects or donations of materials and funds, we are most interested in hearing from you going forward. Adina.
Great. Thank you so much, Raquel and Yoel. That was absolutely fantastic. And I always continue to learn from you. So many questions. So I guess I have the ability to curate here a bit, and I think that we should talk a little bit about the new building. And there was a question about, in the new building, if the public will be able to actually visit and see more manuscripts and how this will be done. So Yoel, did you want to answer that? I know Naomi Schachter's on the Zoom as well, and she's been involved in the new building. But Yoel, why don't you?
Sure, I'll be happy to. One of the reasons why the steering committee for the renewal process of the National Library chose to build a new building was exactly that question of public accessibility and public education. And our current building was built in the 1960s with a very different vision in mind. The vision was a handful of scholarly academics, of professors who were going to go in to do their research and write their papers and books. And today, the conception is, and I think rightly so, that national libraries have an obligation to the general public. And so the new building includes, first and foremost, to my mind, in addition to the reading rooms and the access to scholars, and immediately in importance after that is an exhibition space, both for a permanent exhibition and rotating exhibitions. And that will allow us, we're hard at work on the permanent exhibition, which will, when the new building opens a year from now, will be front and center. And there we'll be putting together a exhibition based on treasures from the library about the power and importance of texts and the power of importance in words in Judaism, but also in other cultures. And it also includes an auditorium, and it also for lectures and cultural events and concerts and movies and festivals, and also includes a visitor center and proper space and resources for the educational system, so that the kids who are coming, whether Jewish kids from around Israel or our program of Arab elementary and high school students from East Jerusalem, when they come to our building and they kind of have to make do with what rooms we can find, there'll actually be proper resources for that. So front and center in the new building is giving as much access as possible, as much educational access as possible to as many different kinds of visitors and readers as possible.
Great. And now getting to something specific about our collections. Someone has asked if we have collected the Yisker books written in the 50s and 60s, and in particular the books of towns in Eastern Europe, written by any survivors.
Yeah. There are many important collections. Yisker books were this phenomenon in the 1940s and 1950s that survivors of various towns in Europe would get together and would create a memorial volume in honor of that town. And it would usually include photographs, documentation, reminiscences, stories, biographies of important people who came from that town. And there are several thousand of these in existence. There are very important collections in Yad Vashem, in the New York Public Library. The Yiddish Book Center has an important collection of these, and we have an important collection as well. There's also a program now to kind of crowdsource translations of these documents into English, and they periodically put out translations into English of these older documents, and we collect those as well.
Great. Yoel, there was a follow-up question with regard to your, comments about the challenges that the library faces, and specifically with regard to our work with any of the state museums who actually also collect Judaica and own that as part of their history. And so the question is, what has been the library's experience and position on who should have those objects?
As we say in Hebrew, kol mikra legufo, each situation should be treated on its own merits. We have very, very good relations with a very, very broad collection of Jewish and state and private institutions around the world. And different institutions have different policies, both in terms of what they're willing to share from their collections, how they're willing to share, how publicly they're willing to make things. We have on occasion done, like we did with the Hungarian team, we've done joint purchases. We've done joint purchases, for example, with Yivo of the Chaim Grada archive, the great Yiddish writer. And each one of these kind of discussions about cooperation ends up being kind of where can we find the common denominators? Where can we find the shared interests? And let's focus on that. And so it ends up, needless to say, as far as physical objects are concerned, each institution wants to have more physical objects in its own collection. And so that sometimes, especially in joint purchases and the like, sometimes can create certain kinds of tensions. But for the most part, there's enough common denominators between the different institutions that we find ways of cooperating, which I think is really the strategic way to go. Ultimately, the world is getting smaller these days, and so and libraries are struggling. Thank God the Israeli government and Jewish philanthropists around the world have seen the National Library in Israel really as an important priority. But public libraries are struggling around the world, and they have to make the case that we're still important. I think it's not a difficult case to make, but I think we have to make that case to funders and to government institutions. And one of the ways we succeed in making that case is by cooperating. And when funders and governments and see that, well, this is working with the British Library, but also with the tiny community archive in this little town, then they realize that they're dealing with institutions that are worth expanding. And that's an important part of our mission is cooperation.
Great. One more question. I know that the Val Madonna is a treasure, and I wanted to pose the question about if you could just talk a little bit more about the Val Madonna Trust and what it is and how we'll be sharing it with the community in the new building.
Raquel, do you want to take that, or
Sure.
if you don't want to, I'm happy to talk about it. Just...
Why don't you go ahead, Yoel, since it's
okay.
Straight in the Judaica collection.
Okay, so
I'm
the
happy
Val
to talk
Madonna,
about the new building, about the Val Madonna.
so yeah, you can talk about the rare books room in the new building and the Val Madonna collection, but the collection itself was a more than 10,000 volume collection collected by Jack Lunzer, a wealthy businessman from London whose love in life was the history of Jewish printing, and he collected the most important collection of Hebrew character printing and some manuscripts as well, and broadsheets, posters. And toward the end of his life, he decided he wanted to keep it as much as possible as a single collection, and attempted to sell it as a single collection for various reasons. That didn't quite work out. But in the end of the day, the 14 of the items, the most important items, were sold at a private auction, and that left the other 10,000 plus, again, depending on how you want to count, volumes available for purchase. And what the NLI did, speaking of cooperation between public and private, between donors and private individuals and the Jewish people, the National Library of Israel worked out an arrangement with a private collector who was interested in a small percentage of these books, and the private collector put down some of the money. The National Library of Israel, thanks to our own circle of donors, was able to put down a significant portion of money and purchase jointly the rest of the Val Madonna collection minus the 14 items. And about 80% of the collection came to the NLI. We carefully went over each and every book and said, do we have it? Is this a better copy than the one that we have? How important is it? And we ended up with about 80% of the collection, which has the biggest and most important contribution to our rare book collection in recent memory. And because of Mr. Lunzer's desire to kind of keep this as uniform as possible, and here I'll pass this along to Raquel, who's more involved in the new building than I am, made a decision to symbolically present the Val Madonna collection in the new building.
And so if you remember, I said that, please God, by the end of next year, we would love to welcome all of you to the new building of the National Library. And if you go down a few flights to our rare book and rare manuscript reading room, which really is a sacred space of inquiry and exploration and beautifully decorated, the walls of the reading room are lined with the Val Madonna Trust, Jack Lunzer's book collection. And so those of you who are interested in seeing it firsthand, you are most welcome to go down to the rare book reading room, hopefully in about a year, in order to see it.
That's great. for those of you whose questions we weren't able to answer, because we've run a little bit over, we'll correspond with you and give you answers after the program. I want to just thank all of you for joining. Thank Raquel and Yoel for their leadership at the library, for their inspiration, for their hard work, and for their partnership with me as a fellow colleague. Thank you all for joining. It is the end of the, close to the end of the year, and I want to express the opportunity and gratitude both at the same time. First of all, to thank those of you who are supporters of NLI. As Raquel and Yoel mentioned, the library does rely on public and private support, and it is very much needed and is part of enhancing the present work and ensuring the future of the library so that it is there for future generations in a variety of ways. So I know that me and my family have become supporters of the library. We believe in it. We've made it a philanthropic priority. We feel that it's important to our heritage. We feel like we want to be a part of doing right by our people, about doing right by our past and our future. And I ask you to join me in supporting the library. And on NLI's website, you can support the library if you've enjoyed our programs, if you believe in preserving the history of the Jewish people, if you want to do your part, and if you are blessed to be in a position to give, please give to the library. We need you. You are an important part of our community. Thank you so much for joining us and for being part of our family. And with that, I turn it over to Duran to open the mic to say hello to one another and to our amazing speakers. Duran?
The mics are open.
Great. So I see Raquel's family members are on here.
This was an absolutely brilliant session and opened up questions that needed to be answered. Even though I know people and I work with people at the library, and my cousin works at the library, Esther, well, she was Koscielek. Do you know, I can't even think of her name, but she lives in Jerusalem. But she works at the library. She was telling me yesterday because she was working with Amalia Kedem. So, and I work with various different researchers. So, but on the musical side more than that, but I was interested in your manuscripts because my friends keep telling me they can't get access to things unless they're an academic or have a special pass or special number to certain things that they want to see. Is that still the case? Because at certain universities, you have this problem. So unless you're a researcher or an academic, you can't see certain manuscripts or certain things that maybe you need to see.
Well, the National Library belongs to everyone, irrespective of your academic credentials. But because we have a responsibility, not just to our generation, but to future generations, we ask that only people who have a specific reason to see an original manuscript, they can request access to that manuscript. Yoel mentioned our flagship TIF project, which is an online platform, a digital library of all known Hebrew manuscripts across the world. And 80% of them have a digital presence, whether it was digitized from the original or from the microfilm. And so people who are interested in getting access to Hebrew manuscripts can do so from their own home or their mobile device. But if you have a specific reason to see an original manuscript, then you are most welcome to come to the National Library. Applications to see manuscripts generally go to the curators, and we don't see a need to filter between academic credentials and other credentials, but mostly it's about the need of the individual and the work that she or he is doing.
So what happens if I want to do an exhibition or something, or a talk, maybe in England or Europe or somewhere, that I might need access or use some of your manuscripts as part of an exhibition, or to show people on something? What do I do in it to enable? Do I have to get copies, or do I have to put it on the internet, or do I have to show it like you're doing today on a Zoom or something like that? Or can we have something that we can use physically for people to use? Let's say an exhibition that runs for a month or whatever it is, which is maybe the books of, I don't know, Chaim Weizmann or something like that, whoever. And if we may be doing something on a specific subject or a specific person, or it could be a musician, it could be Solomon Sulzer, it could be Lewandowski, or it could be something like that, and we need these things or would like these things. So how do we make the best of what you have and use it to show the world, so to speak, or make people know that these things are there? And the most important thing is the heritage, and maybe people's parents, grandparents, families, aunts, uncles, and they maybe come across something like I've done and other people have done and say, wow, there's my uncle, what, Chaim, I didn't know he did this, that, and the other. So these are the things that, it's the connection of the very, very small Jewish world, which is getting smaller and smaller. So how do I do it, or how do we do it?
So Alex, first of all, I would say that the digital solution is a way to get to the masses. And so I welcome you and anyone who else is listening, that anytime you give a presentation, our images are, as much as legally possible, open access. So I would start there. If you're interested in creating an exhibition, we have a department at the National Library who works with institutions throughout the world in lending materials. But again, because we are stewards of this material for now and onward, we need to make sure that the institution can guarantee a certain kind of conditions. But if you're interested in a particular set of books for a particular exhibition, then please be in touch. You're welcome to be in touch with my colleagues, Naomi and Zadina. You can reach out to us, to you all and myself, and we'd be happy to connect you to our colleague who handles these loans.
No, just thank you very much. I found it so informative and interesting, and I can't wait to be allowed to travel. One of my first places will be the National Library.
As we say, Bruchim Habayim, Ehlan wa Sahlan. You are most welcome.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all very, very much. And we appreciate all of you and all of your support. And with that, we'll say goodbye until the next event. Stay tuned via the newsletters, and check out the website for details on all of the upcoming events. Be well, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Toda rabba, Laila tov.
Laila tov.